Good afternoon, everybody. This is Bob Tomasulo hosting you today on Rainbow Inspirations, a program sponsored by Blue Ridge Pride and AARP. Welcome to our monthly program where we talk to community leaders, movers and shakers, if you will, in the LGBT community. Today's guest is a very special one for me, somebody I've known a long time, Michael Harney, who works with the Asheville as an HIV, STD, hepatitis prevention educator. That's a long title. He works with WNCAP, Western North Carolina AIDS Project. And he's been with them since the early 90s. He also has some community nicknames. The most common one is the Rubber Man, kind of self-explanatory. He distributes them wherever he goes. Sometimes Miguel, the Spanish instructor at both AB Tech and Blue Ridge Community College, and sometimes as the Needle Guy, having co-founded the Needle Exchange program in Asheville back in 1994 with the late Marty Prairie. He represents the G in the LGBT plus community and is involved in all types of community activities. You will see him almost wherever you go in Western North Carolina. His long-term partner, Paul Ahrens, and we welcome Michael to our program today.
Thank you, Bob. I'm really excited to be here with you. Thanks for the invitation.
Okay, now you've been involved with the HIV community for quite a long time, going back to the 90s when we were still basically in a crisis mode. And you've seen a lot of changes over the years, certainly. As we all have. The way the disease looks today is quite different from the way it looked back then. And then it was considered more or less a fatal illness. Now it's considered more of a manageable illness. I think that's the correct term. If I use the wrong one, please correct me. But it's changed completely. We have people, particularly older LGBT plus members of the community, who've lived with this for many years and are living a full, active life. Something they probably didn't expect back then. You've seen a lot of changes. How have they impacted your work over the years?
Well, you're right. And I would say that when I started, in the mid 90s, obviously I really was there at the beginning. I remember back in 1986, I think it was with Peter Jennings, AIDS in America. I sat and watched it on the television in my parents' bedroom. So, I've been around it as we have lived through the entire epidemic. And it has changed. A couple of quick notes that of the 40 years of this HIV epidemic that we've talked about and people have been so freaked out about, we've lost about 730,000 people in this country, in the United States of America. And to compare that just with this last year of COVID, in the United States, we've lost about 600,000 people in 1 year's time. So the viruses are a little bit different, but those numbers, we just can never sustain 600,000 people dying for the next 40 years. So when I'm out in the community, as you said, I'm a prevention educator and get a chance to go out to agencies and to groups and to programs and to schools to share some of this information. That's my latest statistic, really, is the 730,000 that we've lost just in this country alone versus the 600,000 to COVID. That's a pretty significant number, I think. And in terms of what has changed, you're right. In the 80s and the 90s, it was not something that people expected to live through or survive. When you talk to people who have survived this long, who are what are called long-term survivors now, you might see in a number of the magazines, POS magazine or Positively Aware or Plus. Those are some of the industry magazines. There are a lot of articles, people who have now lived 25, 35 or more years with HIV and have lost so many people, friends, lovers, all of that, wondering why they survived. How did they survive? There are stories about people's guilt, having survived. If you watch a film like We Were Here or How to Survive a Plague, and you see people like Peter Staley from the early ACT UP days, when he was just a kid and now he's grown into being as gray as we are, sort of thing. He's made it through all of these years. And they are saying at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, kind of the gold standard of statistics. And I know they've had a tough year, been very criticized, but really they are the gold standard when we're talking about anything disease related, that at least 50% of people living with HIV in this country now are over the age of 50 years of age. So many of those people are 60s and 70s, years of age, and it's expected to rise because people are able to live longer with now the new medications that are easier to take, not easy to take, but easier to take than they ever were. The side effects now are more cardiovascular, having to do with kidney function and liver function, more than some of the side effects that people really experience in the early years of those medications and treatments, the therapies. But the therapies are also looking in the future at injectables. So, once a month or once every 2 months, maybe once every 6 months, there are implantables that people could put in their arm, kind of like some of the contraceptives that women have used that are implanted in the arm, able to be used for months at a time and not have to worry about the pill burden of taking your pills. Now the single tablet regimens make it easier for people to take a pill on their way to bed, maybe at night. There may be some other medications or polypharmacy to kind of coordinate with side effects related to cholesterol, statins, things like that. But it has gotten a lot easier. And again, the side effects are not quite as severe, so it makes living better. People can get out and travel and have families and careers now where they just didn't have that hope earlier in the epidemic.
Yes, and I remember early back in the 90s when they first came out with things like AZT, they were pretty toxic and very difficult to take for a lot of people, particularly with weakened immune systems. But that was all we had. There weren't many options, so you took them and had to deal with the consequences and side effects. Now, the side effects tend to be more age-related for older folks because they're coming down with the normal problems of aging, heart problems, diabetes, things like that they never had to deal with then. So balancing those things can be a little tricky, don't you think?
I'd say so. A lot of times doctors aren't thinking about the correlation to the aging process. And as people are living longer in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s with HIV, there is a concern that doctors are not facing the kind of the geriatric needs of people, specialized needs of people also living with HIV. And we know that there's an inflammation, a general inflammation in the body with HIV. And so people who are in their 50s and 60s sometimes present with conditions of the body that maybe a 60, 70, 80-year-old might have. And so that is a concern. There's also a concern that people in their 60s, 70s, and 80s are not being tested for HIV or sexually transmitted infections, STIs. Remember, it used to be VD, venereal disease. It went to STD, sexually transmitted diseases. Now it's STI. So sexually transmitted infections is the term. But people are not being screened for those things, and we are sexually active. Hopefully we're all sexually active until the last days, kind of thing, as much as you want to be in whatever fashion that may be. So there are some differences that need to be looked at and considered aging in general, sexual health, and then on top of that, HIV, particularly in the LGBTQIA community, where the higher percentages of HIV have kind of concentrated just in general in this country over the years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good. We have a question that, what are your personal highlights of the current decade? You've seen a lot of change, and has it made your job easier, more difficult, or how has it impacted you?
You know, I've been a very lucky person. I visited all but 2 continents in the world. Those that I've not been to are Antarctica and South America, believe it or not. Even though I'm a Spanish teacher, I've been through Central America and parts of the Caribbean, but I've never been to South America. That being said, having worked with the now late Jerry Connor, he oftentimes at gayashevillennc.com, which is now kind of incorporated with Blue Ridge Pride here in the Asheville and Western North Carolina region, and the LGBT elder advocates, we've all kind of blended together a little bit. But Jerry would assign me covering the international AIDS conferences. And so I was able to get media scholarships and to travel the world and see what was going on firsthand, all of the data, all the clinical trials, the results, and then what people were doing around the world. It's been more than a benefit to me. I've been able to bring much of that back, share it with the community in either the column that I wrote for years, What the Rubber Man Wrote. Nobody ever read it, I'm sure. I would always ask, have you read what the Rubber Man wrote? They're like, what are you talking about? I was like, yeah, I didn't figure so. But, published columns that covered kind of what was the latest and who was being impacted most by HIV, including people who are aging, those who use drugs through injection, public sex workers, men who have sex with men, whether they identified as gay or bisexual, people who are incarcerated. So I guess, the highlight for me is living in this community around the caring community and supportive community that I live in here in Asheville and Western North Carolina. More than anything else, it's been so much fun knowing people. People know me as Michael Harney, not just Michael, that guy with the mustache and the long hair, but they say my name, oh yeah, I know Michael Harney, Michael Harney, have you seen Michael Harney? That kind of thing. It's just funny to me. I never feel like I've done enough. There's always so much more to do. And being as, I think, isolated technologically, I don't have a cell phone. Most people know that. I don't have Facebook, even though my image is used on Facebook a lot. So I'm sure I'm missing out on a lot of things. But as you said earlier in the introductions, I'll do whatever I can and be wherever I can. I'm always excited to be invited somewhere and to participate. It's a great place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we thank you today for braving the technological wasteland, if you will, to join us. Have you found that the medical community has grown more supportive over the years too? Because I can remember back in the 90s, it was sometimes difficult to find a physician that would accept patients that were HIV positive.
Sure. And we've got a great medical community here with the Western North Carolina Community Health Services, Dale Fell, ABCCM Clinic, MAHEC, for example. They all, and for that matter, Mission Infectious Disease Consultants, Associates. And so they've all done their job taking care of people, Blue Ridge Community Health Services in Hendersonville, and I'm sure I'm missing some out in the further western part of the state. They've come together with great knowledge. They have reduced stigma, been able to touch people, to feel, the body parts as needed, to diagnose things, to provide pre-exposure prophylaxis, which is a once-a-day pill that you can take to protect you against HIV infections, not against pregnancies or other sexually transmitted infections, but it has impacted the number of new HIV infections among people who are taking it. I think that where some of the medical community is now kind of getting on board is treating hepatitis C. Not only treating it, but testing for it, diagnosing it, and then treating it to cure. It is curable for most people within 8 to 12 weeks. The side effects of hepatitis C medications are incredible now that they aren't like the old pegylated interferon and ribavirin where people thought they were just going to die from those side effects. Now people describe a little headache, a little stomach gurgling, a little fatigue for the first week or two, and then are cured of hepatitis C. So more and more the medical community is getting on board with that. Many people who are living with hepatitis C are thought to have been born between 1945 and 1965. So there's an estimated 75% of people living with hepatitis C were born in those years. And if you've not been tested for hepatitis C, the recommendation now is to be tested if you are 18 years of age or older, simply for that fact that you are 18 years of age or older. It is a major concern of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention that people who are unable to access sterile injection equipment, needles is what I'm talking about, represent about 25% of new hepatitis C infections. There is a correlation to that in HIV infections, but they can be young, they can be old. It just happens to be that people who are using needles don't have access to clean sterile injection equipment, may be putting themselves at risk for hep C. The HIV infections are down to 7 to 9% of new HIV case reports are related to the needle or sexual interactions with people who have been using needles and were infected that way. So those are some of the medical things going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, certainly things have changed since the 90s. And I wanted to ask you about, you've been with WNCAP since the early 90s. How did you get involved with this? Certainly you didn't, it wasn't a major in most colleges back then. So most of us kind of got into it accidentally. Is that what happened with you?
Somewhat. There's a picture here. There's a guy named Marty Prairie Chicken. He was my boss and my mentor and my friend. And so I carry that picture where I go, and just on the side, here's my picture, Paul. It may be hard to see, but so in 1993, I brought a donation to the Western North Carolina AIDS Project. People at the time were given 20% of their proceeds for whatever fundraising. And I was told I had to meet this guy named Marty Prairie. I did. I gave him my donation. And the story is that he said, "Hey, is that your red pickup truck out there?" It's an old 1986 Toyota pickup truck that most people associate me with, still driving it today, 35 years later with, I don't know, it stopped registering miles at 305,000 miles. So that was a long time ago, about 12 years ago. Anyway, yes, that was my truck. And could I help move some furniture? Could I help volunteer at the Bell Share booth and things like that? And eventually Marty asked me if I wanted a job doing street outreach. And I said, sure. Okay. What is that? I didn't even know, but some people know that I presented myself in the area of downtown at the time known as the Cage, reaching out to other men, trying to encourage them to use condoms, to be tested, things like that. I worked with Marty at WNCAP, the Western North Carolina AIDS Project. We're trying to figure out if it was 1996, 97 or so when he and I left the agency for a couple of years. Though we stayed in the field and in the business, worked on needle exchange, presented at conferences across the country among Native populations and in tribal communities pretty much. Marty died of HIV-related causes in 2001, and I was asked by Ron Curran at the time, the executive director, Carlos Gomez. Ron was the executive director of WNCAP. Carlos Gomez was the executive director at the Western North Carolina Community Health Services, and George Bond happened to have been the health director at the Buncombe County Department of Health. They all in collaboration asked if I would come back and do this work in 2001. So it's been 20 years that I've now been working at the Western North Carolina AIDS Project. So, is it 25 years, 28 years that I've been doing this work? All those years I've stayed in the field and been involved.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting that when I was I worked with the Social Security Administration, and back in the mid 80s, there was a lot of misinformation about HIV, and to be honest, they didn't really know that much about it then.
Right.
But we were seeing a lot of people come into Social Security offices to file for disability benefits back then. And there was a lot of fear on the part of the staff because they weren't informed about it either. So I was asked to take a crash course, basically. At the time, I was the only openly gay employee that they had. And so they automatically figured I would be the expert. But it was a learning experience for me. And I went around speaking to employee groups to inform them about the facts of HIV and what they needed to know as far as serving those people as they came into offices to apply for benefits. And eventually it became a full-time job for me.
Was that here? That wasn't in Asheville, was it? Where was it, Bob? In another
No, that was, I started in New York City and then moved to South Florida, the Fort Lauderdale area, and did it for another 8 years down there, working with local AIDS groups and organizations to make sure that the benefits that were available to them were applied for and that they would get the income they needed back then, because many of them had to stop working, of course, and had no income to help them survive.
And those are the big states: California, New York, Florida. Those were huge. They still are the top 3 states with HIV cases. You know, you did great work.
Yeah, it was a hectic time, and it was a challenge because everybody was learning at the same time, as you know. We would get the weekly health news from the CDC or whatever, and there would always be something different or something new, different protocols, all sorts of things. So you really had to be on your toes as far as staying up to date.
Well, you've got new generations all the time coming in, and I ask, what are the bodily fluids that transmit HIV? And some of the first answers are saliva. It's still that. So you're having to, re-educate and newly educate these generations. I guess I get frustrated, over time. If we're not giving comprehensive sex ed, we're not talking about body parts and naming them, then we continue to face these challenges. And younger people, who wants to talk to this gray-headed guy, with wrinkles or whatever? They're looking for the next guy who's a little bit more modern, who, is on social media, maybe on his cell phone. It's a challenge to reach out. Some of the newest infections still are among people who are 25 to 35 and 40 years of age, actually. Part of that 13 to 24-year-olds, they were really a concern over the last decade. But now they're in that 25 to 30, 35 to 40-year age range, and lots of new infections happening in that population, which, if they then get infected, are willing to go take their medications, are expected to live, normal lifespans. But that's now another 30 or 40 years of this. It's not going away anytime soon.
No. And it is difficult to reach, particularly younger people, I think, because they look at gray-haired guys like you and I, and they say, they don't know anything,
Yeah, been there, They'll find their way, I guess. We all do, right?
Yes, we do. Yeah. Have you worked much with the schools here?
Have over the years. It depends on what schools. I talk about the 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th graders. They're a tough crowd, but they really are fascinating because those who are in the 6th grade see me then in the 7th grade and then in the 8th grade. So they actually get, generally speaking, last year was very different with COVID, but generally would get 3 consecutive years building upon what they were told or taught last year, remembering a lot of what they heard, and then hearing it again, the next year. So it's been fascinating. I've been at Asheville Middle School. I've been out to Cherokee to their high school. Not all schools have invited us in. I've been over to North Buncombe and done some programs with a couple of the science classes there. We've been out to Robbinsville and the 7th graders periodically, Clay County, been out there too. So it's just been hard to get into the schools a little bit. Some of the universities, Western Carolina University, Mars Hill, UNCA, AB Tech, Warren Wilson, they have done testing events where we've done HIV, STD, or STI, and Hep C testing events. Condom distribution is pretty significant at many of the universities. So we provide thousands and thousands and thousands of condoms every year to these agencies, to the schools. Can't get them into the junior high and high school settings, but we also tell those young students where in the community they might find a basket of free condoms at some of the coffee shops, at some of the stores downtown. And so people have access to them freely without having to be embarrassed to go in and get them. When I've heard young kids in the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade talk about porn sites that they visited and they ask questions, it's not like it's brand new to most of them, to be honest with you. And that's hard for parents to understand, that children nowadays, kids, young adults, if I'm not telling them, they're learning it online somewhere, and I'm not sure they're learning all the things. Scarletteen.com is a great website for them to go to, but if they're not getting the accurate information, they're making it up. And there's a lot of myths out there that I'm able to debunk when I'm in a face-to-face situation. Some of my colleagues are working with younger people as well through our prevention department at the Western North Carolina AIDS Project. So, kind of depends who invites us. As much outreach as we do, it also takes kind of the word getting out there and being invited in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I want to remind the listeners, if they have a question, just type it into the comments box, and we'll try to answer it to you. We got about 5 minutes left, and we'll answer any questions you may have. The other thing I think that's a challenge, and you mentioned it briefly, and you have it yourself, I know, is the technology piece of all of this. Sure. It changes almost monthly. And certainly in the past year, we've all had to make some major adjustments about technology. Before COVID, I did not know anything about what we're doing today, how to do it. And, right. I was fortunate to find some people who did, and I was able to learn what I needed to learn. And I think a lot of us have faced that. It's a great way to communicate, though, I think, to people with the information that you have to provide. Because that's where particularly the younger folks and older folks too are on computers, and that's where they look for their information. So it has to be there and easily found.
Well, I'll tell you, so I'm a nerd. Everybody knows that. And Grindr, if I say Grindr, I imagine most people who are listening are familiar enough with Grindr. But on Grindr, in the policies and terms of use, that kind of thing, if you go through it, there's a prevention message from a Dr. David Malbranch. He's this amazing doctor down at Emory in Atlanta. And he gives a whole kind of a prevention message about HIV and STIs and condoms and PrEP and all of this kind of stuff. And I ask people, look, I don't have Grindr, I don't have an account, but I know when I see the blue and the orange and the blue and the orange when people are typing away at the bars, that they're looking. And I asked them, have you listened to Dr. Malbranch's presentation there on Grindr? They're like, what are you talking about? So they haven't even looked at it. So though it's there, they may still not be accessing it, even on a social media platform as modern as Grindr or Scruff or, Silver Daddies or all that kind of stuff. It's very hard to get the message out. And what you do is hope that you have a conversation, that this moves on to, grandparents and parents and friends, and the conversation comes up, that it then trickles down to the younger people, that they get the message and keep the message. Who is going to step into my shoes, for example, with this information? How do they reach out and then perhaps prevent the 35 to 40,000 new HIV infections that occur every year in this country continuously, have been like that for over a decade. How do we prevent it? If you're not going to talk about it, and hopefully have the next generations talking about it too.
Mm-hmm. Yes, great. And there are lots of resources out there too, not only locally with WNCAP, but the CDC website. AARP has a dedicated site, aarp.org/pride. where you can get information on HIV and the latest topics. There it is on the screen.
Yep.
And so there is the information available. Just make sure you access it and get accurate information. That's key to the whole thing. And we're kind of running out of time. I want to thank you, Michael, for being with us today. You're a wealth of knowledge and a real asset to the LGBTQ plus community. And we wish you well in the many years you're going to continue working, I hope, in this field, because we depend on you for a great deal of
Thank you,
information.
Bob. It's really exciting to be with you and have the audience there. Please know that they can be in touch by touching base with me at the Western North Carolina AIDS Project. All of that's information easily accessible. You can always call my home number. It's still in the phone book, believe it or not.
Do they still have phone books?
They're a real thin one.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We'll be back here next August 4th is our next program at 12 noon. Look forward to seeing you. Thank you and good afternoon.